A fairy, also fae, fair folk or faerie, is a type of mythical being or legendary creature found in the folklore of multiple European cultures including Celtic, Slavic, Germanic, English, and French folklore, a form of spirit often described as metaphysical, supernatural or preternatural. Myths and stories about fairies do not have a single origin, but are rather a collection of folk beliefs from disparate sources. Various folk theories about the origins of fairies include casting them as either demoted angels or demons in a Christian tradition, as deities in pagan belief systems, as spirits of the dead, as prehistoric precursors to humans, or as spirits of nature. The label of fairy has at times applied only to specific magical creatures with human appearance, magical powers, and a penchant for trickery. At other times it has been used to describe any magical creature, such as goblins and gnomes. Fairy has at times been used as an adjective, with a meaning equivalent to enchanted or magical. It is also used as a name for the place these beings come from, the land of fairy. A recurring motif of legends about fairies is the need to ward off fairies using protective charms. Common examples of such charms include church bells, wearing clothing inside out, four-leaf clover, and food. Fairies were also sometimes thought to haunt specific locations, and to lead travelers astray using will-o'-the-wisps. Before the advent of modern medicine, fairies were often blamed for sickness, particularly tuberculosis and birth deformities. In addition to their folkloric origins, fairies were a common feature of Renaissance literature and Romantic art, and were especially popular in the United Kingdom during the Victorian and Edwardian eras. The Celtic Revival also saw fairies established as a canonical part of Celtic cultural heritage. The English fairy derives from the early modern English faerie, meaning realm of the fays. Faerie in turn derives from the Old French form faerie, a derivation from fail from Vulgar Latin fata, the fates, with the abstract noun suffix -ere. In Old French Romance, a fae or fée was a woman skilled in magic and who knew the power and virtue of words, of stones, and of herbs. 3. Fairy was used to represent an illusion or enchantment, the land of the fays, collectively the inhabitants thereof. An individual such as a fairy knight. 3. Fail became modern English fae while faerie became fairy, but this spelling almost exclusively refers to one individual, the same meaning as fae. In the sense of land where fairies dwell, archaic spellings faerie and faerie are still in use. Latinate fae is not related the Germanic fae from Old English phage, meaning fated to die for, yet this unrelated Germanic word fae may have been influenced by Old French fae or fairy, as the meaning had shifted slightly to fated from the earlier doomed or accursed. The term fairy is sometimes used to describe any magical creature including goblins and gnomes, while at other times the term describes only a specific type of ethereal creature or sprite. 7. Historical origins of fairies range from various traditions from Persian mythology 8 to European folklore such as of Brythonic Bretons, Welsh, Cornish, Gaelic, Irish, Scots, Manx and Germanic peoples, and of Middle French medieval romances. According to some historians such as Barthélemy de Bellot, fairies were adopted from and influenced by the Peries of Persian mythology. 9. Peries were angelic beings that were mentioned in antiquity in pre-Islamic Persia, as early as the Achaemenid Empire. Peries were later described in various Persian works in great detail, such as the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi. A peri was illustrated to be fair, beautiful, and extravagant nature spirits that were supported by wings. This may have influenced migratory Germanic and Eurasian settlers into Europe or been transmitted during early exchanges. 10. The similarities could also be attributed to a shared Proto-Indo-European mythology. 11. In the Middle Ages, fairy was used adjectively, meaning enchanted, as in fairy knight, fairy queen, but also became a generic term for various enchanted creatures during the late Middle English period. Literature of the Elizabethan era conflated elves with the fairies of Romance culture, rendering these terms somewhat interchangeable. The modern concept of fairy in the narrower sense is unique to English folklore, later made diminutive in accordance with prevailing tastes of the Victorian era, as in fairy tales for children. The Victorian era and Edwardian era saw a heightened increase of interest in fairies. The Celtic revival cast fairies as part of Ireland's cultural heritage. Carol Silvers and others suggested this fascination of English antiquarians arose from a reaction to greater industrialization and loss of older folkways. Fairies are generally described as human in appearance and having magical powers. Diminutive fairies of various kinds have been reported through centuries, ranging from quite tiny to the size of a human. 13. These small sizes could be magically assumed rather than constant. 14. Some smaller fairies could expand their figures to imitate humans. 15. On Orkney, fairies were described as short in stature, dressed in dark grey and sometimes seen in armor. 16. In some folklore, fairies have green eyes. Some depictions of fairies show them with footwear, others as barefoot. Wings, while common in Victorian and later artworks, are rare in folklore. Fairies flew by means of magic, sometimes perched on ragwort stems or the backs of birds. 17. Modern illustrations often include dragonfly or butterfly wings. Early modern fairies does not derive from a single origin. The term is a conflation of disparate elements from folk belief sources, influenced by literature and speculation. In folklore of Ireland, the mythic Isidore people of the fairy hills have come to a modern meaning somewhat inclusive of fairies. The Scandinavian elves also served as an influence. Folklorists and mythologists have variously depicted fairies as the unworthy dead, the children of Eve, a kind of demon, a species independent of humans, an older race of humans, and fallen angels. 19. The folkloristic or mythological elements combine Celtic, Germanic, and Greco-Roman elements. Folklorists have suggested that fairies arose from various earlier beliefs which lost currency with the advent of Christianity. 20. These disparate explanations are not necessarily incompatible, as fairies may be traced to multiple sources. A Christian tenet held that fairies were a class of demoted angels. 21. One story described a group of angels revolting and God ordering the gates of heaven shut. Those still in heaven remained angels, those in hell became demons, and those caught in between became fairies. 22. Others wrote that some angels, not being godly enough, yet not evil enough for hell, were thrown out of heaven. 23. This concept may explain the tradition of paying a tind, or tithe, to hell as fallen angels. Although not quite devils, they could be viewed as subjects of Satan. King James I, in his dissertation Demonology, stated the term fairies referred to illusory spirits, demonic entities, that prophesied to, consorted with, and transported the individuals they served in medieval times. A witch or sorcerer, who had a pact with a familiar spirit, might receive these services. 25. In England's Theosophist circles of the 19th century, a belief in the angelic nature of fairies was reported. 26 entities referred to as devas were said to guide many processes of nature, such as evolution of organisms, growth of plants, etc., many of which resided inside the sun. Solar angels. The more earthbound devas included nature spirits, elementals, and fairies. 27, which were described as appearing in the form of colored flames, roughly the size of a human. 28. Arthur Conan Doyle, in his 1922 book, The Coming of the Fairies, The Theosophic View of Fairies, reported that eminent theosophist E. L. Gardner had likened fairies to butterflies whose function was to provide an essential link between the energy of the sun and the plants of earth, describing them as having no clean-cut shape. Small, hazy, and somewhat luminous clouds of color with a brighter, sparkish nucleus. That growth of a plant which we regard as the customary and inevitable result of associating the three factors of sun, seed, and soil would never take place if the fairy builders were absent. 29. For a similar concept in Persian mythology, see Perry. 81. Time it was thought that fairies were originally worshipped as deities such as nymphs and tree spirits. 30. And with the burgeoning predominance of the Christian Church, reverence for these deities carried on, but in a dwindling state of perceived power. Many deprecated deities of older folklore and myth were repurposed as fairies in Victorian fiction. See the works of W. B. Yeats for examples. A recorded Christian belief of the 17th century cast all fairies as demons. 31. This perspective grew more popular with the rise of Puritanism among the Reformed Church of England. See Anglicanism. 32. The hobgoblin, once a friendly household spirit, became classed as a wicked goblin. 33. Dealing with fairies was considered a form of witchcraft and punishment